into Week 13 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few quarterbacks I look to get off the wire this week. The first guy, Mac Jones, at the New England Patriots. So this Patriot team riding a high and having a great season this year here with the rookie Mac Jones, winning 7 ball games in a row now. So Mac Jones, the last few games for him, Week 10 versus Cleveland, 198 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. Week 11 at Atlanta, 207 pass yards, a touchdown, and 1 rushing yard. And then Week 12 versus the Tennessee Titans, he had a good ball game, 310 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 11 rushing yards. So right here, Mac Jones, he's been more of a game manager than anything for this Patriot team. But there's some games where he's gone off and put up numbers. And right now, he's available in 62% of fantasy leagues. I know next week he's got a tough matchup here in Week 13 at the Buffalo Bills that give up the least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But I still like Mac Jones as a player to add this week. And it wouldn't surprise me to see him have a decent performance at Buffalo. So if you're in a tough spot at quarterback or in a 2-quarterback league with buys and stuff, I think Mac Jones is a good guy to get on the wire this week. The next quarterback's Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. So Tua and Jalen Waddle have a great rapport this season here. And Tua, he's been a mediocre quarterback, I'm not going to lie, this season. And of course, he's been injured as well early in the year. But the last few games here for Tua, Week 10 versus Baltimore, 158 pass yards and a rushing touchdown. Week 11 at the Jets, 273 passing yards, 2 touchdowns in it though. And then Week 12 versus the Panthers, 230 passing yards and a touchdown. Week 13 though, he's definitely worth an add in my opinion, with a good matchup versus the New York Giants, who give up the 13th most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season. Even though we just saw, obviously, Jalen Hurts pretty much get shut down in that Eagle team in that ball game. But right here too, I think he'll make a few plays in that game. He's looking to run the ball a little less, which is good, where he's trying to be a better pocket passer. And right now, he's available in a whopping 64% of fantasy leagues here, and he's definitely a quarterback I would pick on the wire this week. The next quarterback's Trevor Siemian of the New Orleans Saints. I know Trevor Siemian struggled in his last ball game, but that was a tough one versus the Buffalo Bills, where he only had 163 pass yards, a touchdown, and an interception. But before that, he was on a decent pace with Siemian. Week 9 versus Atlanta, 249 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, and a fumble loss. Week 10 at Tennessee, 298 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And then Week 11 at Philly, 214 pass yards and 3 touchdowns with 2 interceptions and a rush touchdown with 16 yards on the ground. So right here was a tough matchup versus Buffalo. But in Week 13, I think he'd have a good ball game versus the Dallas Cowboys, who over the last few weeks, let's be honest here, they got carved up by Derek Carr in that ball game. Bridgewater a few weeks ago as well have a good game versus Cowboy defense. So right here, I think Siemian can make plays. It's a Thursday night game once again. Saints are at home, and they're due for a big offensive performance, especially after losing 4 in a row as New Orleans. So Siemian, who's available right now in 95% of fantasy leagues, I think he's a good quarterback to get in deeper leagues off the wire this week. The next quarterback's Daniel Jones of the New York Giants. So Daniel Jones, it's been a crazy up and down season for him here. 1 week he's droppable, and the next week he's a guy you could go back on the wire and get him. This week here, he's another guy who would go out there on the wire because of his matchup at the Miami Dolphins that give up the 5th most fantasy points to quarterbacks in the season. So right here, Daniel Jones is a better fantasy quarterback than a reality quarterback, and who knows if he'll even be the starter next season for this Giant team, with a new regime most likely coming in and possibly drafting another quarterback. But anyway, Week 9 versus Vegas, 110 pass yards, a touchdown, and a fumble loss. Week 11 at Tampa, 167 pass yards, a touchdown, 2 interceptions. And then Week 12 versus Philly, a pretty decent game, 202 pass yards, a TD, and 30 rushing yards. So right here, he's an add because of the matchup in Miami. And he's available in 72% of fantasy leagues. So I think he could put up 20, 25 fantasy points at the Dolphins, who give up the 5th most points in Week 13. I think he could do it as Jones. And the 5th and final quarterback I look to get on the wire this week, Andy Dalton of the Chicago Bears. So we don't know if Justin Fields is going to come back or not here for the Bears in Week 13. But Andy Dalton, in the 2 ball games he's played since Fields went down, Week 11 versus Baltimore, 201 pass yards, 2 TDs. And then last week at Detroit in Week 12, 317 pass yards a touchdown, an interception, and 11 rush yards. So right here, this offense ran a little better with Andy Dalton at the helm. He's more obviously of a pocket quarterback than Justin Fields, who I feel like looks to run almost every other play here for this team. But right now, it's a tough matchup in Week 13 versus Arizona that gives up the third least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. But right here in this ball game, I think Andy Dalton, if he is going to play and start in this one, is going to get a lot of garbage time points. And at least he could stretch the field here to Darnell Mooney and Allen Robinson if he comes back here in this one in Week 13. So I think Dalton's a decent option, and he's available widely in 97% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few quarterbacks I look to get on the wire for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.